Our sermon passage this morning comes from Matthew 14:13 through 22, which says, "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said to them, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' Then they said to him, 'We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over from the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. There were about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children."
Just after the end of the American Revolution, only a few years afterward, anger towards monarchy all over Europe started to increase, and it got really intense in France. Revolution filled the air. Nobility, because nobility was really living this really lavish lifestyle, this incredible having everything you could ever want kind of thing going on, while the working peasants, who just kind of like are the working class, had almost no food, right? They couldn't buy basic stuff. They would spend almost 50% of their salary just to buy food. So they were getting really, really upset. Now, royalty, up to this time, had leaned on the church and its doctrine to defend itself as a divine right. And people, they look at this and they have a real hard time believing in God when there's no bread. And that led to an atheistic philosophy spreading out throughout all of France, because God's apparently, if he's put these people there, we need to get rid of these people. The one way to get rid of these people is to take away any sense of the church. If I can do away with the church, and if there is no God, then there is no right to be royal. And so they really get going, and they've started adopting the philosophy, if you like philosophy, they started adopting the philosophy of people like Voltaire and Rousseau, and all that started gaining traction. And there's this one legend that has it that Queen Marie Antoinette was told that her starving subjects had no bread, and her supposed infamous response was, "Let them eat cake, a brioche." It's totally disconnected. That became a sort of a standard, an indicator that the royalty had no idea what was actually going on in the streets. They had such luxury that the worst thing at her table was basically a cake. And so she's imagined, just let them eat the most basic thing. Well, that was even more expensive and more extravagant than the basic thing they were asking for. So disconnected, right? And so that kind of loses its validity to rule when you're that disconnected. Her careless attitude toward ordinary people reinforced the accusation that a corrupt monarchy, which fueled the French Revolution, and it gave power to atheism. She would literally lose her head in 1793 at the guillotine, as the period of this violent atheistic ecstasy began in France. If you think, I tell you what, if you want to go read a really horrible, horrid, terrible sort of way revolutions can go read about France in the 1790s until Napoleon takes the lead. I mean, it was as bad as it could get, as you could imagine, just people just killing each other all over the place. And in the end, you realize there was no good side to this. There was not like, it was like the good guys and the bad guys, and we're looking back on it. Any monarchy of the era at the time would have used Jesus to defend the rights of the monarchical rule because Jesus is king. Thus, they would say that's how the universe works. That's the basic thinking line they would have used. Yet they really functioned like Herod Antipas in the story before the feeding of the 5,000. We didn't read the feeding of the 5,000, the story before it, when Herod Antipas kills John the Baptist. And so that's what he does in the story right before him. John the Baptist was arrested for protesting Herod's incestuous marriage to his own niece, Herodias. Then she does that. His daughter, Herodias' daughter, does this dance, and his passion is inflamed, and he promises that he's going to give anything they ask for, and they ask for John the Baptist's head, and his foolish promise and this foolish wish leads to the beheading of John the Baptist, and you have this nightmare of a banquet. You know, for thousands of years, bread, banquets, and real power are part of the same thing. Bread becomes this image of what it means to have power. And these stories merge in Moses when he's walking through and he gets manna just after leaving Pharaoh and, overturning Pharaoh. You saw it last week if you were here on Wednesday nights. We covered the story of Elijah, who is feeding the widow and getting fed by God from the ravens after dealing with the really evil king Ahab, who worships Baal. And you have this power play involved in that. You have it again in Elisha. It happens over and over again. And so this morning, we're going to look at the real source of power, the purpose of power, and sharing God's power. The first question, who brings home the bread? I didn't want to say who brings home the bacon because Jesus is Jewish, and at that point I thought that might not be appropriate. So who brings home the bread? Bread is nourishment. It is economy, the basic need of life, right? Bread is that basic thing. We take it for granted now, but for thousands of years, that was the most basic, essential thing to keep you running. And if someone were to give Marie Antoinette a political survival kit, which translated Jesus' miracle for her, it might say something very similar in today's words. It's the economy, stupid. Right? You got to pay attention. You got to pay attention to what political power is tied to people's ability to purchase the basic necessities of life. Now, we give people power to bring home the bread or bacon in our culture in so many different ways. We want leaders. When you think about what kind of leaders are we looking for around us? We want leaders who can enrich our pocketbooks, protect our assets, and make life easier. I'm not talking about necessarily in here, but that's the general overall nature of what the main thing people are looking for. And that's what we call success, when people can do those things. Now, a great number of folks would look at someone like Herod Antipas in this era. They would look at Herodias, and they would look at that luxurious banquet that they're in, and they would say, that's success. That's luxury. That's what real living looks like. They've got it made. In fact, they might even say that's what it looks like to have God's favor. We have the privilege of hindsight in this story, and we say what? What evil fools. But that's not how it looked to everyone in the ancient world. You have to take your mind and your imagination back to the moment where most of the world would have said, that's what I want to be like. Every election cycle, we come around and have people who promise to bring home the bacon or the bread, but only want to keep their power for real. We know that that's what's really going on. I mean, we're not fools. We stop caring about if they can do it, we don't care about their lies. We don't care about their sources. We don't care about their lack of principles anymore, as long as the bread is on the table. And you might say, well, is that too far from home? Maybe that's just kind of out there in the political world, or maybe it's too close to home for some of you. Let's get closer. I say most of us, since most of us want and are in the working class, I think most of us consider ourselves working class, I'm going to guess that every single one of you has had a time in your life, if not right now, putting bread on the table, bringing the bacon home. And you've had times of financial uncertainty. You've had times where you're not sure how you're going to make ends meet. You know, recent studies constantly indicate that the richer we become, the worse our ethical behavior. Why? because we believe deep down in our bones that we are the source of our success. And once we have it, once we've secured that bread, we will do anything and everything to keep it and destroy anything that threatens it. It's that little Herod inside of us that has this going on. And so when you've had moments where you've needed and you've been desperate for money, the moment you get it and you have it, you would do almost anything to make sure you're never back in that position again. Because it's not a good feeling. We all know that. Not sure how you're going to get food on the table. You know, churches and several of my periodicals will, in fewer words, tell you, and they don't say it in this many words, but they'll tell you how to market your church and attract people. And instead of trying to attract people to Jesus, the aim and the way they're talking about it is how to attract people to your church. It's subtle, but it's more like doing your part to make sure this happens. It's about bringing home the bacon and then doing horrible things. We see it happening right now in our own denomination. We see it happening in other denominations where we'll protect leaders who abuse women, and we will we'll make sure that we're some kind of magnet of attention. So even if we have to destroy other churches or talk bad about, and this happens behind the scenes more than in front of the scenes, or we had to have these marketing gurus to sell our church. Some point we stopped. This is not all churches. There's a temptation, might be a better way to say it, to sell your church rather than talk about glorifying your God. Herod of this world will take over our governments, our workplaces, our church structures, and even our own hearts if we fail to follow Jesus into the wilderness each and every day for our daily bread. He's got the bread. And when we think we're the source, when we think we're responsible for protecting it, it's me and mine, and I'm responsible for my growth, our hearts quickly turn into destructive passions. Every Herod in our world depends on a social order which will never slip, or his or her impotence will be revealed. And so we go on this destructive desperation. Do you know how many people I know live in destructive desperation? They will destroy anybody or anything around them to make them feel themselves just a little better today. Sometimes we have this desperation, not knowing if we're valuable, not knowing if God loves us, not knowing if others love us, not knowing where we're going to get our next bite of a real relationship that means something, or real bread, or whatever it happens to be that you need, and we get desperate and we get destructive. And I see it all over. And Jesus says, follow me into the wilderness. Follow me. Are you as tired as the 5,000? Who follows him into the wilderness and wants something that leads to life and leads to this deep sense of rest beyond the desperation? See, the world isolates Jesus here from its social structures, from its institutions, which would normally be deriving power from and comfort and stability. If you remember back in chapter 12, it's a while since we've been there, but in chapter 12, the Pharisees basically toss him out. They don't want anything to do with it. He's tossed out of religion. We read 2 weeks ago, he went back to his home in Nazareth. He was kicked out of his home church. Not only that, he was basically excluded from his family. He had problems with nobody except him, not his hometown, not even his family. So the institution of family is also gone. And then we read here, the governments, the institution of government is completely at odds with his kingdom movement. Every institution, because he isn't playing their games of death. All the institutions of culture vanish, and the one who really loves you is Jesus. Jesus is the source of life. It's that simple and that difficult to turn yourself and follow him into the wilderness. You know, these 5,000 men and these countless That's just men, 5,000 men, and then countless women and children who are part of this. You see at the end. They follow Jesus because they believe, at least at that moment, that Jesus is promising a new way of life. And to accept Jesus, you have to say, I really do want a new way of life. I have a new way of thinking. He won't kill. He's not going to lie to me. He's not going to protect his honor to get his throne. Instead of killing for a kingdom, he's going to die for a kingdom. For you. For prosperity. He's not going to use you as a political pawn. He's not going to say, you know what, vote for me. He says, I'm king of the world. I'm going to die to be king. No vote's going to matter. Jesus is the source of life, eternal life, and life today. It means that every day we follow him into the cities, into the village, into work, into schools, into churches, or into the wilderness, and trust that he is the bread of life and that saves us. In other words, you may not literally walk into the wilderness, but everywhere you go, you're going to be tempted to live in a Herod world, and you've got to say, I need only the bread of Jesus to trust in. Is he the real source of life for you this morning? Is he that? Would you abandon all for him as he abandoned all for you? Jesus invites you to this banqueting table. You know, taken from the Song of Solomon. Some of you might know this song. Taken from the Song of Solomon. There was a song in my youth which repeated the phrase from that book. He brought me to his banqueting table. You know that song? And his banner over me is love. I think that really catches the flavor and the what's going on right here in this text. Earlier I asked him to read Psalm 23 with cups overflowing, of preparing a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. And that means that even though all this chaos, the people who want to destroy me, he is here and he's preparing this table, this place of calm, this place of provision in the midst of a world of chaos. I think most of us need that. I know I need that each and every day. All over the Bible is this image of a great final banquet as well, of victory at the end of time. And if you were with us in the last few weeks, I'll just kind of recap if you weren't. The parables, several of the parables in 13, end at the end of time. They tell you what's going to happen in God's judgment at the end of time. And at the end of time is this other thing that wasn't yet talked about, is this great banquet God's going to throw for his people at the end of time. This incredible time of complete victory, I would call it. And this feeding is a foreshadowing of that final banquet. So really, this image captures the past, Moses and all of that. It sets them in the present of his kingdom, and it also points forward. It's really almost, I was telling Brad, it's almost what it is. In other words, when you read it, you can reach in and you keep pulling things out, and you keep pulling things out. It's just this short parable, and you can endlessly pull the bread, in other words, meaning and depth out of this parable, this miracle over and over and over. And you'll get my love for this particular. I almost have so much to say. I'm trying to put it in a little basket for us this morning. But the invitation that he gives has directions. And it's real simple and real hard. Abandon all other kingdoms and trust Jesus as king. That's a way to the feast. That's the way to the final banquet. To say, I surrender everything else in my life. You are king. I want to be part of your victory. These people dropped what they were doing. They followed without provision, except that little boy who brought 5 loaves of bread. We know from another story, brought this little bit of bread and a fish. This isn't like a trust test where you just fall backward and Jesus catches you and you're like, oh, I trust you. You're trusting him that it's going somewhere. There's a vision to what God is doing, creating a kingdom of compassion. You're trusting him. You're trusting and saying, if I am like you, Jesus, and I live a life of compassion, and I'm in your kingdom of compassion, you will provide for me because you're the king of compassion. See, people follow him into a private time, because Jesus is trying to get away here. He's trying to be alone, it seems like, probably to deal with some grief because of John. And you ever try to go off by yourself and people keep bugging you? Get kind of irritated, like, leave me alone! He doesn't do that at all. He's like, he completely has compassion for them. He's deeply connected to the needs of his people. There's not going to be let them eat cake. He knows who these people are. He knows their needs. And he's the true king. So instead of saying, let them deal with it, with whatever, he makes out of himself the bread. See, where King Herod Antipas is led by his passion, Jesus leads with his compassion. So we are often led by our passion. In other words, his desire for Herodias and his passion. And Jesus leads with his compassion, because if you're just filled with passion, it's going to lead you. If you're filled with compassion, you become a leader. And he is the ultimate king and ultimate leader here. The compassion of God is why he went to the cross and let his body be broken on our behalf. He broke himself for us. This love and sacrifice is enough for the world many times over. Oh, by the way, if you're looking for another connection, this has a lot of verbal connections to the Lord's Supper, which we did last week. Like I said, you keep dipping your hand into this miracle, and there's more and more there. So Jesus is powerful enough to transform the hardest hearts and interrupt the darkest empires. And the question is do you believe that? Do you believe that when you look at your family? Do you look at that when you look at your own heart? Do you look at that or believe that when you look at our particular government situations? In other words, what does Jesus have to do with D.C.? John very well thought that the kingdom of God had something to do with their government, right? I mean, with Herod Antipas. He went to him and said, you're not supposed to be marrying incestuous people. That's not kingdom of God activity. We have a right, we have an ability to call those who are leaders and say, no, you have to follow this exact thing. But we go to them and we say, Jesus is the one. Jesus is the pattern, and that's what I'm asking you to do. It's not be perfect, but pattern your life after Jesus. We have a right to call our leaders to that. You have a right to call me to that. We have a right to call other people to that. But we usually leverage power to create kingdoms of death.
Could you try?
She wants to join me in preaching. When Napoleon's armies invaded Europe, his general discovered that there was he would say something like an army marches on its stomach. In other words, it needs food. And foraging food takes a lot of time. But if they started carrying their own food on their backs, by the time they got where they were going, the food was spoiled. And so the French military put out this reward of 12,000 francs, that if somebody would come up with a way to preserve food for X amount of number of weeks, then they would get this great prize. Now, 12,000 francs at the time, that's a lot of money. That's not like $12,000 now. That's a huge sum of money. And it was 15 years later, actually, and this guy named, what was his name? Nicholas Appert, discovered the basic principle of canning. He put food in a glass jar, he put the sealant on top of it, and then cooked it at a high temperature. And it would last for weeks. That was the origin of canning food. And the origin of canning food was so that they could make it more efficient to kill people. Think about that. The bread, essentially, we take it and we use it to do power our way, to destroy. All I need's an edge. All I need's an advantage. Now, I know much good has come out of it since then, and we're able to store food in our in our own cabinets for this reason. But I mean, there could have been better reasons to come up with the reason to can food, like not letting people starve. No, it was so that we could make sure, which was the problem, if you catch my drift, that was the problem 10 years before. Nobody cared to put out that 12,000 francs when people were starving. They only put that out when it was time to decide we need to win a war. That's when when someone started caring enough to put some money on it. But the purpose of God's power is to create a compassionate kingdom. God's love is all we need. And you hear me, I want you to hear me rightly when I say God's love is all we need. I'm putting a big, if you could see it, I'm not sure if it's up there. Oh, it's not up there. I didn't put it up there. God's love is all we, in bold letters, need. I'm not saying we don't need other people to love us or that we don't need to love other people. What I'm saying is we need the community God's love creates as well as God's love. His love creates a kingdom. And we need those people as well. Every other so-called love that you're going to encounter in this world destroys because it sees itself as a consumer. The one who fills my passions, that's what we call love. The one who makes me get what I want. I want you to think about how love, normally used today, often describes someone or something that fulfills my inward passions and needs. And if it fails to keep fulfilling that passion, I stop loving it. This is why marriages are failing and having trouble. Not the only reason. It's one of the major reasons marriages are having trouble, because it's subject-based or it's me-based rather than love being about the other. Now, I want you to think about how love normally, again, is used. And then think of Jesus. What is he doing here? He doesn't need anything. His compassion fills them rather than asking anything to consume him. I want to say this in the best possible way. Jesus doesn't need you to complete him. And because of that, he isn't going to use you up. He's going to give himself up. That's love. When we know that he is enough and we're taking from him, we don't have to use others up either. And that's how he builds his kingdom. His love in us is so immense that I don't need to consume other people and their and all that they have to fill me. Yes, I want to be loved and I want to love and we want community, but I'm not having to protect it because I have all I need in him. That creates this amazing community of compassion rather than passion. That creates a really deep love in spouses who seek God's compassion and can give rather than need. And you are invited to this banquet. That's what this is about. This ultimate victory, this ultimate banquet, when you say, I will give my heart to you, Lord, I trust you with all I have, you are handed to Jesus and he, as you say, I know you're enough. I'm ready to, all these other places I've trusted, all these other institutions, all the way from religion, like religiosity, to even family and home, to putting all my hope in that, to government or subsidies or whatever it happens to be. I have enough in you and you're enough. And then all those other things will start falling in place. It's not like he wants you to go away with home or do away with the other stuff and completely isolate yourself. He wants you to put him first. And once you've had that moment and you go back to that wilderness and you say, I want you first, I want you first, I want you first, those other things in life will start forming around him too. But you're invited to this banquet. If you've never accepted the invitation to this banquet, I want you to accept that this morning. To say, Jesus, you are enough in my life. I want to accept you as Lord and Savior of my life. And you'll have an opportunity to do that here in a few minutes when I'm down at the front. But here's the aim that we have to keep in mind. Disciples share God's power. This is a huge moment right here. I think this is incredible. The disciples play a more important role in this miracle than any other miracle in the Bible. And this miracle is in all four of the Gospels. It's the only one of this Galilean miracle that's in all four of the Gospels. And so John's execution, John the Baptist's execution, that would have shaken the kingdom movement. I want you to think about that. One of the very leaders of the Christian kingdom movement, or the Messiah, they would have called it more like a Messiah movement, that gets shaken. And Jesus, again, is rejected by every institution, but he reminds his disciples that they are taking part in something more powerful than any old institution with this miracle. He's saying, I don't rely on any of those other institutions. I think most Christians who come every week want to take part in something eternal, powerful, and unshakable. What's the pathway to an unshakable life? Well, Jesus tells the disciples not to send people off. But what does he say? You give them something to eat. Knowing very well they can't do this, right? You give them something to eat. And they almost scoff at him. We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here's the first lesson you have to learn. Admit you can't. Admit you can't do it. Admit that the calling he puts on your life is not something that you can do on your own. Lesson number 1 up here. I did not think for a long time that I would be able to get up and speak in front of people. That's a very difficult thing. That's not natural for me. And I think Jesus wants them to admit that they can't do it on their own. There are a lot of things in life where we're not enough, where we can say, I can't. And this world around us tells you, never say I can't. Never do it. Never do it. No. Tell Jesus, I can't. Be honest. I can't do it on my own. Maybe you can't fix a relationship. Maybe you can't make ends meet. Maybe you're not finding peace in your life or company. And then Jesus says to them, what does he say? I love how he says it so plainly. Bring it here to me. Bring it here to me. Oh, those blessed words. We're pretty used to say, give it to Jesus. Right? I'm going to give it to Jesus. Let Jesus take the wheel, whatever it happens to be. It's a catchphrase that is both correct and incomplete. It's correct and it's a little short on this particular subject. It doesn't mean give to God and sit back and do nothing at all, like be a stoic or just watch God work. It doesn't really mean that. In fact, Jesus blesses it, and then what does he do with it? What does Jesus do with the bread after he blesses it? He breaks it. What does he do? He hands it right back to them. Jesus, I thought you were going to do this without me. No, he hands it literally, puts it back into their hands for them to go and share it with others. He's going to take it, he might bless it, and he might say, here, go do it. What's the difference? That you have trusted that he made the formerly impossible possible because he's touched it. Sharing God's power and love requires it coming from your hands and your mouth. He wants it coming from your hands and your mouth for you to learn how to do what he does, because we are made to be in his image. We are made to do what he does. And so he literally takes and does what he does, hands it to them that they may do what he does. That was a kind of confusing there maybe. A lot of pronouns. But you get the point. The multiplication isn't first for their benefit. Do you see that? The disciples don't get the first benefit. They spread it to others. But what they find is that sharing doesn't empty them. Not only does it not exhaust God's grace, they have 12 baskets from which to eat and continue sharing. Now, the baskets aren't like, okay, now I get to go do my own thing. That's not the idea behind it. The idea is that there's 12 tribes of Israel and that there's enough for all God's people. That he is enough. If you obey God, do you trust that your basket is going to be full at the end? I don't mean you won't be tired. You may very well be tired. But that God has more for you than you could ever give. And when you're giving for God's sake, you're not giving out of your pocket, you're giving out of his basket. I'm not talking about money. I I was afraid people might take that from there. I'm talking about loving other folks. I'm talking about spreading the good news that Jesus really has more forgiveness than any of you could ever exhaust. He has more forgiveness than what you might call the most sinful person in town. He's got more forgiveness and more hope and more help for you than you could ever even imagine is available. I want you to take that to him this morning. I've had some experience. Brad and I talking about this text, and we've had an experience with this on Fridays at 10 a.m. every other week. It's at the end of the week, and sometimes I'm a little tired, and there's a group of folks at the Heights, very hungry for Jesus, very hungry for some compassion. And some of you go there and do this with us, and you probably could say amen. But we take our little meager selves there with what we do and offer what God's given. And every time I walk out of that place with people singing out of key, out of timing, sometimes interrupting my speaking through the intercoms for the menu for the day, whatever it happens to be, things that might otherwise get me or irritate me, make me laugh. And I'm more full of the Spirit and energy than when I arrived. I don't know how. I don't know why. Maybe that's not your calling. Maybe it is. Maybe you need to join it. But there's the food pantry. There's some of you I see doing ministries around here that maybe don't get noticed by everybody. And I hope that that is bringing you life. You're not going to exhaust them. And we feel the love of some of your own ministries. And it means something to each one of us. Sometimes it's your prayer ministry. Sometimes it's encouragement ministry. And I want you to know that that is feeding people. It's caring. People feel that care. Sometimes they don't want to come up or say something or are too shy, but they tell me, so I'm going to pass it on. So many of your ministries to people are making a difference in their lives. They're seeing Jesus handing out bread and you sharing it. The more you focus exclusively on your relationship to God without others, I'll tell you what, you'll get legalistic, you'll get destructive, and you'll get exhausted. You'll be in the image of so many leaders, but the more that you give just because you love Jesus and because you love others, and they're the reason you do it, you'll be full of energy for Jesus. This week, I want you to find one person to invite to God's banquet. Now, I don't mean necessarily go and say, come to Jesus, although that might be that. I want you to pray about who to go talk to. Encourage them. Share with them about Jesus. Sing with them. Call them just to say you love them. Do something for somebody, even if it is a difficult person to deal with. Even maybe if you don't have that time, trust God with that time. You're not going to exhaust God. But without God, you're going to be exhausted in the worst kind of way. Trust Him. He loves you. He knows you. Take His bread.